pleasure, let me introduce Manu Pillai. He's a historian and the author of 4 books. His first book, The Ivory Throne, won Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar. He has published widely in Indian newspaper and writes a column for Mint Launch. Manu also holds a PhD in history from King's College London. His 5th book, which we all are really waiting for, is scheduled for December 2024 release.
Hello, everyone. A very good evening. We have one more author with us, Samhita Arni. Since childhood, Samita Arni has been passionate about retelling mythology in contemporary cultural context. She has authored 4 books beginning at the age 11 with the Mahabharata, A Child's View, published in over 7 languages and selling over 60,000 copies. Her second book, Sita's Ramayana, a collaboration with artist Moina Chitrakar, became a New York Times bestseller. The Missing Queen is a spec-fi mythological thriller based on the Ramayana and the Prince, a historical fiction set in the Sangam era, won the 2020 Neve Book Award. As an adult, Samhita explores the critical ways women participate in and are excluded from mythological and historical narratives. She is also an educator and is retraining as a psychologist, aiming to reimagine stories that shape more liberating identities for ourselves and our children. We are glad to have you both and welcome to Neve.
So it is my extreme honor and privilege to be in conversation with Manu today. So just to get a sense in the audience, how many of you have ever thought of history as a potential career option? Adults, you're also allowed to answer this. Okay, one person, 2 people, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, I see about 7 hands went up.
I think they're just trying to flatter me. I don't believe this number very much.
So just to start with that, Manu, from the very beginning, this is the very start of the story. What on earth possessed you to become a historian?
No, I think just the stories around us. You take something as simple as football, right? You think on the face of it, this is a game. This is a game you watch on TV. This is a game you play in the playground. But in reality, even something as simple as a game can represent so much. How did football even begin? It began somewhere in Europe, in England, if the story is to be believed, with people kicking the bladder of a pig. There was no ball. There was a bladder of a pig that was, well, designed a certain way and stitched up a certain way. And that's what they'd kick from village to village. There was no ground. This was just a very rowdy game. So much so that I think the King of England at one point even tried to ban it, saying that this horrible game needs to stop because it's just an excuse to start riots and pick fights with people. In India, in 1911, there was this big match, big now from our perspective, but a match in 1911 in Calcutta where for the longest time all the clubs were open only to white people because the British were ruling India. So only Englishmen could play in these clubs. And then the Mohun Bagan Club, I think, set up by Indians for Indians to play football. They decided that they'd play a match against one of these British teams, one of these white people teams. And remember, even now, like football gear or sports gear in general is very expensive. You need to find the right shoes. You need to have the right kind of ground, all of that. The British people had all of that. They had the right shoes, they could practice, they could train, they could give it their time and commitment. But what happened on the Indian side was that the so-called team, somebody worked in the public works department, somebody was a clerk in a government office, somebody was a teacher. And in those days, to get a good pair of shoes for football, it would cost about 7 rupees. And 7 rupees was the teacher's salary per month. So there's no question of the Indians having access to either a good playing ground or either like good gear or shoes or any of that. And yet they managed to make it to the finals of this league of sorts. So much so that a lakh of people, 100,000 people heard of this unheard of thing of an Indian group of brown men playing football barefoot, somehow defeating a bunch of white people's teams all the way to the finals, and they ended up winning that final. So that simple game of football, why did it attract 100,000 people in those days when there's no social media, no TV, no radio, none of that all over the place? Because it was about nationalism. It was just the pride that, oh my God, look at us, despite everything being against us, everything being stacked to sort of privilege and advantage the white people, we've managed to defeat them. So simple story of a football match in 1911 suddenly takes you back to pig's bladder. It can take you to nationalism, people's sentiments for their country, their love for their country, the individual stories of these people as clerks and teachers coming together to do this. It can also tell you about some of the difficulties, when they first tried to put together a cricket team, an Indian cricket team. Today we think of an Indian cricket team and we take it for granted, right? There always has been an Indian cricket team. But 100 years ago, it was not the case. It was very tough to even decide what would make an Indian cricket team because people were fighting about caste and religion. So how many Hindus, how many Muslims, how many Parsis, because Parsis were big players of cricket in Bombay. Then they were fighting about how many castes. You know, would this caste be represented? Would that caste be represented? So it took years and years and years just to create an Indian cricket team because nobody had any consensus on what Indian even meant. So cricket and football, just small things we take for granted now, can have so much history packed in it. And I was just fascinated by those stories.
I think you won a lot of hearts by talking about cricket and football. I think it resonates with a lot of people in this room.
By the way, I play neither. So.
But what I also was struck when I was listening to you is that you could take something very small, or even just an incident, or just the 7 rupee fact, and you turn it into a story, into something that's revealing about the time. Now, I've often heard this thing that history is the story of great men. What is your response to that kind of idea of history?
And since you asked this question about women in history, we all think of the family. What is a family? It's father, mother, children, right? But in Kerala, where I come from, the family was not father, mother, and children. It was the mother, her children, and the father used to marry and come into the family. Women never married and left. Men used to marry and come this way. Women always stayed there. The property went from mother to daughter. Surname went from mother to children. So I would have my mother's surname, not my father's surname. My father would be a complete non-entity, a visitor to the house who, if tomorrow his wife died, the man would have to leave. He would have no business living in the house because he has no claim on the house. And the reason I mentioned this titular Maharani of Travancore is when these royalty, the royal women in this matrilineal system got married, how did they get married? The girl would be taken to a window like this or a balcony. She'd be shown a bunch of boys. And she's about 10 years old. She'd be shown a bunch of boys, told, pick whichever one you like. And then she would choose, okay, she's like, I like that one. That's going to be her husband. You would think that, you know, they would match horoscopes and all of that. None of that. The priest would be called after the selection was made. And the priest would be told, look, the princess has decided what she wants. You better make the horoscopes match now. And then that's how the horoscopes would be matched. Even then, after the marriage, the husband could not stay with his wife. She was royalty, so she stayed in the main palace. He had to live in an outhouse. At feasts in the palace, she would be served 4 types of payasam or dessert. Her husband would get 2 because he was always 1 notch below. When they went out for drives, etc., the Rani had to go in the big fancy limousine or a big carriage with 6 horses. Her husband had to follow in a small carriage behind. He could not sit with her because if you sit with her, it signifies equality. And the husband is not equal to the wife. So he's 1 step lower than the wife. And sometimes, you know, even divorce was possible. There was this Rani in the 19th century where her husband was seriously ill. Everybody knew he was dying. It's not like she sat by his bed and wept. She asked her staff to lift the bed and take it out and send him to his own house to die. And then she summoned 7 new people and chose a new husband. The moment he popped in his own house, she chose a fresh husband from a set of 7 options that were presented to her. This was the kind of world my own ancestors belonged to. But that's a matrilineal system. Even in patriarchal families where it's husbands and men have greater control and so on, you always find cases where women still sort of assert themselves and still find ways to put themselves forward. So sometimes, you know, with history, it's not just what you read, it's what's between the lines. Sometimes it's not just what's written, it's also what is silent and what is omitted. So if you actually, 7 of you claim that you want to become historians. If you actually become historians, part of your work is going to be exactly this, not just reading material and regurgitating it, but actually finding out what is not written. Why is it not written? Why is it that most of the history books are written by men and very few are written by women? Why is it that most of the history books talk about battles and fights, but they don't talk about the domestic world where in those days women used to operate? Why is it that when you think of Akbar's wife, who was this Rajput princess, we think of this woman in parda, hidden away inside the palace, but in reality, she was one of the biggest trading magnates of the time. She had one of the biggest ships in the world called the Rahimi. And when the Portuguese made the mistake of attacking her ship, she had the Portuguese, for all practical purposes, booted out of the Mughal court. So women were present, it's just that we haven't learned to tell their stories.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that as a woman.
Who's written great books.
Thank you for that. But I wanted to return to also your book on the Travancore royal family, the Ivory Throne. these women are navigating a complex time outside. I mean, their culture is this matriarchal culture, but the larger story that they have to navigate is a male-dominated one. So what lessons can we learn today from them about how to navigate power and leadership for?
Well, it's never been easy for women. I don't think it's easy even now in the so-called modern world. I think in many ways the world is stacked against women. For example, as a kid, if I wanted to be out playing till 8:39, my parents would never bother. So long as you were home for dinner, you could do it. But my sister had to be home by after dark because she was a girl, there was a fear of security. There was a fear that after dark, girls are not safe, and therefore she had to be pulled back into the house after a certain point. As a kid, I never noticed it. We were treated as equals in every other respect. But just in the way the world is designed, just in the way society operates, there were different rules, unstated, unsaid rules, but they were different rules for her and for me. Sometimes it's also conditioning. You know, as a boy growing up in this family, anytime I wanted something, I would just demand it. I'm 16, I can't get a motorbike yet, I want a scooter. And I was like, okay, you'll get a scooter. I want a mobile phone. So I would demand things, whereas for some reason she never thought that she could even demand things like that. And it's only after I would make the demand that she would realize that she could actually also ask for things. So I think the world it conditions girls in a different way. But the good thing is also women have always stood up to this kind of thing. There have always been women who've broken the rules. There have always been women who've questioned the rules and so on. I could have told a story, but some of the kids here are very young, so I won't go into that particular story. But there are cases in which subversion takes place not necessarily in some grand way. It can happen even at home. I think one story I could mention is related to my own grandmother. You know, back in the day, after you hit a certain age for girls, they had to go and segregate themselves for a certain number of days every month because they were considered impure. So there was a separate room in the house where girls had to sit for those many days till they were considered pure again. Now, my grandmother was forced to do this. This is the 1940s. She'd be segregated in a room. But small subversions, right? Small ways of resisting or standing up for yourself. Every time the rest of the family went and sat down for lunch in the afternoon, which was in a different part of the house, she would slink out of this room where she was supposed to be impure and hidden away, go and touch everything in the house and make it impure. Her father's desk, her father's clothes, her mother's clothes, the kitchen, whatever she could find, she would make it impure and then come back and hide again in that so-called purity room. So even in small households, you just ask your own grandmothers, you just ask your own grandfathers. We think of them today as grandmother, grandfather, as if they were born to play these roles, but not really. My grandmother once went and pushed a poor blind man into a bunch of thorns simply because she was a little kid and she was naughty. I think of her as granny now and this great matriarchal figure in the house. But in reality, she was also a kid once who did all kinds of strange, funny things. Her older brother was 18 years older than her and he used to smoke these fancy cigarettes. And she and her younger brother once snuck into his room, picked up some cigarettes and tried to smoke it when they were about 10 years old. And and of course they coughed their lungs out and they were caught. But it reminded me of how I, when I was 14, tried to steal a cigarette and smoke and see what this was all about and hated it as well. So these stories are all around us, and I think for standing up, we don't really necessarily need iconic figures in some very far away place. Sometimes the icons are just around us, in our own families, in our own neighborhoods. We just need to ask and we just need to get to know their stories as well.
Thank you for that, Manu. And I got a sense that history is not just things that unfold on a larger stage, but there are also these intimate space things that you remember about your family. Like even the stories of your family are a kind of a history. And I think that's a good space for a lot of amateur historians as well to start in this. But I also want to extend this out to the audience. I have many, many questions for Manu, but I realize that the purpose of this masterclass is a more intimate connection with him. So if anybody here has a particular question, just raise your hand as well. And I'll keep going on if no one raises their hand. But if somebody has a particular question that they'd like to raise, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll pull you into the conversation as well. Yes, yes. Unlike other sessions, yes, adults are allowed.
Yeah.
What would you think is the your best practices or the way forward for us in this century?
I think just a level playing ground for everybody, right? right now the ground itself, it's like what I was saying about the Mohan Bagan people defeating the British. Everything was stacked in favor of the British, and yet they defeated them, playing football barefoot, right? So when the ground is stacked against you, when the field is not a level playing field, that's when you have to fight and stand up and make it that way. And I think even with gender, that's what we're aiming for, which is that the world in many ways is designed to operate on male terms. The timings, sometimes even the AC settings in offices, because women do, apparently there have been studies that show that women do get colder than men do, but because offices are built by men, by male architects, keeping men in mind, often AC temperatures are set at a way that's very uncomfortable for women. And you actually see this in a lot of offices where the women are wrapped up in their dupattas or whatever, but the men are quite okay. So something as fundamental as that. There are cases where one hears of stories where people, the first women who went to college in this country, they just found that there were no toilets for them. Because although they had admitted girls there, nobody realized that they needed toilets there. And there had to be clean, hygienic toilets and so on. So I think just creating an infrastructure that allows everybody an equal chance will, I think, reset things automatically over a period of time. And that's why men also resist, no? Men also don't want the world to stop being a male-designed and a male-oriented world.
I saw another hand up somewhere here, I think. Okay. So, I have another question actually, in case while I'm waiting for other people to come in with theirs. Please, where do you find your stories from? I mean, there is research that you do. I know you spend a lot of time in archives, but there's these other kind of remembered stories. How do you come across them?
I think I was a very inquisitive child. I just asked lots of questions, and asking questions, of course, today the world has changed. Kids are allowed to ask questions. When I was growing up, it was very like, behave like a kid, don't engage in adult conversations. Like the adults would all be talking, and we were supposed to silently sit in a corner, and I would pip up and ask questions or try to offer my opinion on these adult questions. Even if sometimes it was my grandmother and my mother and aunt and all sitting and gossiping about something, I would offer and venture my own idea of gossip and all of that. But I think asking questions and cultivating minds to just keep asking questions, it's not just about history, right? It's about anything. Even if you want to identify an injustice in life, it comes from asking questions. Why is it this way? You know, why is a certain habit okay and something else not okay? Sometimes, of course, it doesn't mean you stand up and ask your parents why you should go to school, because I think at some level you need to still trust your parents to know that, you know, they'll guide you into the right things. But still, at a lot of other levels, you should be able to ask questions. If somebody tells you such and such a thing happened, and, you know, teachers have always stood next to a blackboard, and students have always sat there, and teachers have always spoken at the students, and the students have to silently absorb everything. Why? Like, why is that the structure in which a classroom is organized? Why can't we stand up and ask the occasional question? Or why can't the format of education itself be altered a little bit? Ask interesting questions like that, and look at the world not as a given. Look at the world not as, oh, this is how the world is and this is how it's always been. Ask questions of everything that you see in the world in general. I think that would help with history itself. To be curious about everything, yeah. But not too curious. Yesterday in my main session, I was telling them how, as a kid in the morning, I had a session where I was telling them how, as a kid, I was very inquisitive also about fire, and I nearly set my house on fire. Please don't do that. But other things you can be curious about.
Kind of want to ask about that, but I'm going to stop myself. Is there an interesting question from any? Yes.
Hi. So, having read some of your books and some of the recent books, one of the questions is, when you write history, is this tension between the fact and the narrative of that time? Even today, when some of the history books try to frame themselves around the current narrative about the country and how great we are. And there is always a mix of both. It's a combination of fact and fiction written. How do you deal as a writer of history with this tension?
So historians are trained to be able to interrogate the source as well. So where just because something is written in a document doesn't mean it's gospel truth, right? Who wrote it? You have to figure out who wrote it, what that person's background is. Is it a high class, upper or echelons of society kind of person? Is it somebody from the margins? Is it somebody from the ground? Who is writing? Based on that, everything can change, right? Even in this classroom, the way a teacher will perceive the world and the child is perceiving in the same classroom, there'll be fundamental differences in it. And the historian is trained to ask that question. Then you're like, what is the language in which it is written? If it's written in some courtly elite language like Sanskrit, or is it written in some pedestrian is the wrong word, but like a more like earthy, rooted kind of language, right? It represents also what segment of society they're coming from. Why does even written material matter? Why can't it be oral history? Because so many people in our country were not literate. Even now, people aren't fully literate. So in a society built on orality, where most people were not literate, oral narratives matter. It's not just the written documents that matter. Where are the gaps in the document? So any source you get itself, you're supposed to interrogate. I think bad history happens when you take sources at face value and just accept that and put it down. And there's like negative ways also in this, which this works, where a great king will say, I conquered this kingdom and conquered, I don't know, 5 million, I got 5 million pieces of gold. He's also showing off. It's a bit of propaganda. Now you have to then do the math. Is it possible that the kingdom he conquered had that kind of treasure? Did it have that kind of revenue at that time, in that period, etc.? And try and join the dots and figure that out. So again, you have to keep asking questions of the source itself in order to reach a conclusion.
My question is that the tellers of these stories in the past have always been patrons of or the male voice. So when you do your research, how much of the other do you hear? Like how do you tend to corroborate or
You look at as many sources as possible. So you don't just look at,
largely
not always, not always. So sometimes you'll find, so there's case, I'll give you an example. In one of these Himalayan or like up north, there's this Rajput hill state. And there's a scholar called Arik Moran who's worked on this. And he basically talks about how in the 19th century, there was a queen who ruled over there, briefly, a woman in power. Now, if you look at the official Rajput chronicles, there's barely a mention of her. She's always the next ruler's mummy. And there's no sign that she actually wielded power. Why? Because according to Rajput custom, women could only be written about in certain ways. You could not officially write about a woman in power because that was not the done convention in Rajput tradition. But by then the British were already there. So the British were writing about the same thing, and they recorded the fact that this Rani was actually in power. So even though the Rajput record is silent, the British record gives us a lot more details on this woman in power and what she was actually doing. Now listen, both are written by men. So there is the male gaze. So the British have recognized this woman's existence, but they're still talking about her in very negative terms. Because any woman in power is seen as a scheming, negative kind of figure. So then the historian's job is to put both records together, but also be able to filter out that patriarchal side of the British and try to get to the grain of the matter, of what could be the possible system in which she operated. So it's a bit of like there's a bit of that's why you need to analyze history and not just read history. You have to. It's an analytical process, and you have to really seriously apply your mind in order to get down to something that you can call that says that you can claim resembles the past, as opposed to some perfect certificate saying this is what happened in the past. I can never perfectly say that. I mean, history is always about debate, right? There's always going to be narratives and counter narratives. I make an argument, you make a counter argument. The question is, which is the more convincing argument? Who's connected the dots in a more compelling way, as opposed to somebody who's done it in a sloppy way? So ultimately, none of us were there. Neither I nor the other person were ever there in that time. It's just that we are connecting dots in different ways, and you have to gauge which one's done it, who's done it in a more complete fashion.
I'd love to take a question from a younger person in the audience.
The younger people
Yes,
are all
yes.
speechless. Oh.
how do you take out bias when you write something?
So you can never actually remove complete bias. That's the frank truth of the matter. Why? Because the historian is also a creature of this time and place. I was born in the 1990s, in a certain time in this country. I've been raised in a certain kind of family. Certain topics interest me, other topics don't interest me. So some degree of subjectivity is going to be part of what I choose to write about and how I write about it. But when you're trained to do this, you're also trained to minimize the bias. So as opposed to being nakedly biased about what you're writing, you're trained to minimize it to say 5%. So it will be 95% aspiring to objectivity, but there will still be a degree of bias in it, and that's just the way it is. That's why never accept anything any historian says at face value. You have to also be aware that this is an argument that specific historian is making and not the truth. So also don't believe your history textbooks for that reason. Every government comes and changes the history textbooks. Why? Because they all have different agendas as to what they want kids to study. So it gives you facts, but it also facts with a certain flavor.
Also, I think someone said that proverb, don't repeat history or something like that. How do you repeat history if like the times keep changing?
So that's why there's a saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, which is that because ultimately history is shaped by human beings, and human beings have certain core impulses. We fall in love, we live, we die, we're scared of death, we're frustrated in love. You're too young to understand that, I guess, but
You don't know.
You'll get there soon enough. So, because human impulses are same, and ultimately societies and the world are all shaped by human beings, there are patterns that keep repeating. So, you look anywhere in the world, you'll find that great empires rise, but they also collapse, and you'll find that often the collapse happens for very similar reasons: internal decay, internal rot, internal stagnation, and then the collapse begins. It doesn't matter which part of the world it is, that's the case. You find another pattern where violence and power are very correlated. Much of the world until the last 150 years ago was a very violent place. The kind of punishments that were used were extremely violent and extremely graphic. For example, I don't know if anyone here is a Malayali, I'm from Kerala. There, a guy had to be punished in 1805 or so, and the way they did it is, well, today they'll send you to jail, I guess. Over there, what they did is they tied one leg to one elephant, another to another elephant, and basically drove the elephants in different directions and tore him to pieces. Yes. So human impulses at that level, power, violence, the way we behave, those impulses are often common, and that's why they say history doesn't repeat itself, but that it rhymes, because those impulses and patterns keep recurring. That's all.
Great. Thank you. Those were very wise questions. Thank you. Any other young person? I would like to give the preference to young people in this room. Yes, I see. Yes.
Sometimes in the gaps, sometimes in the footnotes. So my very first book, the main character of the book, on whom I've written a 700-page book, existed until then as a footnote. And then because I found that footnote interesting, found that sort of cornered story interesting, I started digging and digging and digging. It took research in 3 continents, sourcing material took 6 years, but ultimately I was able to flesh out the person. I still don't think I've completely fleshed her out because I don't have a real window into her mind, but based on what I could unearth, I was able to create some kind of, sort of bring her from the margins into the spotlight. So I think sometimes you have to just look in the gaps in order to identify them. And sometimes you also have to just look at existing material with a different gaze. So, for example, there was a Bhakti saint. When you think of Bhakti saints, if you've come across this in your history books, you think of these people singing bhajans to God. So Meera singing about Krishna and so on. There was a Bhakti saint about 700 years ago called Janabai. And one of her poems begins with, God, do me a favor and kill my mother-in-law. God, do me a favor, kill my father-in-law, sister-in-law. She wants to liquidate the entire family. Now, and you think, what is this doing in Bhakti poetry? Isn't Bhakti about God? But in that poem to God, she is also arguably making a statement about her position in life as a woman in a domestic setting. That because men, like she's actually a maid servant in the house of a male Bhakti figure. Because he's a man, he's free to go out, engage in these intellectual ideas, move around freely. This is a woman who's stuck in the kitchen all the time. So in her poetry, when God comes to her, God doesn't come in some divine avatar wearing silks. He comes and helps her in the kitchen. He washes dishes with her. He removes lice from her hair. She even scolds him sometimes saying, you're not doing a good job. Because her poetry is about her situation and her place and her self-expression. So through Janabai's poetry, you can get a sense of a woman already saying that patriarchy is frustrating 700 years ago. But she's not saying it in that language. She's not using our jargon. She's using the wording and the language that was familiar to her at that time, structured through God and devotion and all of those things. So, you have to sometimes look at the existing material and sort of tease it in an interesting way to understand what the writer or what the person is trying to communicate and not just read it at face value.
Thank you for that. Yes, young.
Why do you think that women were so undermined in they are undermined and not very well shown in history books and stuff. So why do you think it's like that? Even though they play a significant role sometimes, it's still not mentioned in the stories.
So there are various theories for this. Of course, one is that once you create a certain kind of society. So once a patriarchal society takes shape, it then perpetuates itself, right? You create a system, that system perpetuates itself for as long as possible. People form vested interests within that system. So men then have an incentive to always keep women under their control because they gain from it, right? Because the system operates on those terms. So once something gets institutionalized, that continues for a long time. It's very tough to unearth that, or uproot that. Even now, for example, in the 21st century, people talk about how during the last election, 2024 national election, how many women got tickets to contest? There's the other day where was it? I think I was hearing this in a podcast about how there's a village somewhere where the seat was reserved for women. So she became the pradhan of the village. A woman became pradhan of the village. But her husband used to walk around with a tag on his car and a kind of nameplate on his door saying P Pradhan, which is what? Pati of Pradhan. And he was the one actually dictating a lot of the decisions. So even when you try to change it, the old system will try and clash with it. There are theories as to why the system originated. One theory is that as we moved from nomadic life to settled agrarian life, agriculture, farming, and once we settled down in places, land started to matter a lot. Earlier we were nomads, we were just wandering, so land did not matter. Once land mattered, agriculture came into the picture, people started getting very fixated on succession. If I'm working so hard on my land, I wanted to go to my children. Now, to have your own children and legitimate children, you need to control your wife. So suddenly the woman's role becomes more and more domesticated. These are various theories for it. I won't bore you with too many of them. But the thing is, yes, I think we can safely say that men can be blamed for a lot of these, of what you pointed out.
And thank you for asking that question. Yes.
So you read as many sources as possible. And I'm saying not just sources in terms of written sources, you weigh it against all kinds of other sources of information. So we're in Karnataka, take Tipu Sultan of Mysore. You think, okay, he's a sultan, he was a king, so there'll be a lot of written documents about him. You're only getting a certain version of events from his perspective there. Then you need to look at other sources around him. What did his enemies say? What did his friends say? What did his subordinates say? Are all of these pieces matching each other, right? So even an emperor like Akbar, he's famous for being tolerant to all religions and all of that. In his own court, there were people criticizing him for that. They wrote secret histories saying that, why is this man doing this? This is not acceptable and so on. So you're getting his side of things, but you're also getting the opposite side of things in it. Then you look at diverse sources. So with Tipu again, there's a huge painting in Srirangapatna if you go to his palace. And you should look at it closely because it's a very massive piece on a wall. It's a mural. And it depicts the Battle of Pollalur in 1780. Most of the painting is just carnage. For every chopped off head, you will find a corresponding body somewhere in the painting. Arms have been cut off, this and that. But in all this carnage, Tipu Sultan is shown sitting on a horse smelling a rose in this great serene pose because he's winning the battle. And this is his way of communicating that, look, I'm so confident that I'm winning this battle. His enemy is an English colonel, and that English colonel is shown sitting in a palanquin chewing his nails. Now, is this a representation of reality? Yes, in that Tipu did win that battle. So yes, it's a representation of reality. But it's more than that. It's also a piece of propaganda. It's also Tipu trying to show that I'm so confident that even in this carnage, I can just smell a rose because I'm so convinced of victory. And he's showing his enemy as this very sort of, lame figure who's not even brave enough to get on a horse and fight. He's hiding in a palanquin chewing his nails. So you need to be able to look at that kind of art. You need to look at buildings. You need to look at, material evidence. You've heard of the partition of India in 1947, right? Now, in most textbooks, you'll hear the numbers. So many million people displaced. So many people had to migrate. All the numbers are there. But where is the emotional texture? There's fiction. A guy called Manto wrote a bunch of short stories then. And in Manto's short stories is where you get the emotional turmoil of having to leave your house, leave everything there, and move to this side. There's a historian called Achal Malhotra who wrote an entire history book using things that people brought with them during partition. Now, when partition happened, most people thought that they would go back and bring their valuables and their furniture and all that at some point. That didn't happen. So when they traveled, a lot of people traveled light. Also, there was no time. In many cases, there was no time. People were escaping. So what did they carry? So they're everyday objects. A lota, a water bottle, a glass. These were the things some people came with.
Now, 75 years later, they've never been able to go back home. So suddenly that glass is not just a glass. It's a representation of what was once their home. It was the last thing that they were able to bring from there and bring it here. So a historian has written an entire book using just these everyday objects, one earring, one glass, one lota, one belt, a sari, a locket, a lock of hair, things like that that people were able to bring. So partition is no longer about facts and figures and numbers. It is about people's lived human emotional experience. So, you have to be able to look at diverse sources and suddenly the story comes alive for you. Of course, there are comical stories also. There was this one Sultan in Gujarat, and you don't believe everything you come across. There was this one Sultan in Gujarat called Mahmud Begada, and they say that in those days, kings often got assassinated and poisoned and all of that, right? Because other people wanted the throne. And there's a story where they say that his mother was so paranoid that he'd get poisoned, that from the time he was a little baby, she microdosed him on poison, gave him small amounts of poison to build up immunity, to the extent that he got so poisonous himself that if he wanted to kill someone, he just had to spit on them, and that person would collapse and die. Don't believe that kind of story, because that's obviously a bit of masala added to it, but yeah.
Wow. I have a question. Okay, I see a bunch of questions. I also had a question, which is, if there is a young historian in the audience today and they want to bring this emotional experience that you talked about into their writing about history, how do they do that? Where do they go? How do they start?
Just start, but don't lose yourself in the process. What often happens is, when we get through this process of becoming a historian, you follow an academic path, you get your degrees, you get your PhD. By the end of it, most people are just jaded. You're taught to be very clinical about things. Whereas my whole perspective is that you should never lose that emotional life of history. As I said, history is not just about the numbers and the facts and figures, it is about human experience. And human beings are ultimately also people who tell stories. And I think the combination of good history is the combination of good research with good storytelling. Because we are emotional human beings, we are emotional creatures by design. So we can't just study something in some removed fashion. It matters, it's important to be able to analyze things critically, but ultimately we have to breathe some life into it ourselves. And that, I think, depends on each person's tastes and conviction and their training and their preferences.
Thank you for that, Manu. Yes.
I think you'll get to a stage where people will ask you for your opinion. So normally what happens with us is, in my time at least, in school, all we did was what we used to call ratta maroing, which is you study, you write that in an exam paper, you get your marks and you move on, you've already forgotten what you studied. That's the system in which we were raised. But then when we went to college, and there, even though the system was very similar, we had some really interesting teachers who would make us think. Which was like, okay, this is a historical episode. This is a complicated episode. Let's say two kingdoms have fought. You have the reasons for both sides, or two religious groups are in a conflict. You've got their, both sides' version. How are you as a person going to approach this? What is your opinion? We were asked for our opinions. When we were asked for our opinions is the first time we started thinking, in the sense that it wasn't that, I have to learn these facts to put it on a paper when I'm doing my exams. Suddenly I had to think and sort of analyze and come out with an opinion of my own, and it had to be a reasoned opinion. It can't just be, I feel this way. No, if you feel this way, why do you feel that way? You have to be able to explain it. So I think you'll get to a stage in your future studies where your teachers will start asking you for your opinion to understand how your brain is functioning and how you're thinking and how you're explaining your point of view. And I think in India, that's still something we don't do much, because the system itself, the education system itself is so overloaded that teachers sometimes have no time to go into some of these things, because they're also under a lot of pressure. So the answer really is to read a lot, have these conversations with your parents and keep asking questions to your parents. Even if they yell at you, keep asking questions. That's fine. They're your parents, where will they go?
And I just wanted to pick up on something you said, Manu. Yes. Just to build on this, that if you feel something when you're reading history and you have an opinion, your advice is to reflect on why you feel that way. And that is, if you put that in, that opinion is a reasoned opinion that can be part of your historical.
You have to be able to explain why you've reached that opinion. Having an opinion in itself, anybody can have an opinion, right? You have to explain why you've reached that opinion and how you've reached that opinion. Then that has some value. Because even the person you're explaining it to can learn something from it, and even they might change their opinion on the basis of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I just want to say, when you're writing something, right, there are usually two sources you use, there's primary source and the secondary source, right? There's like research.
Are you doing a PhD or are you?
I'm just asking.
Yeah.
Like research papers and maybe like
Yeah.
letters or something like personal from historical context or written. Which one do you think is more valuable for when we write like a story and maybe?
Primary, for the simple reason, what is a secondary source? So when I'm doing some research, a secondary source is the early reading I do, right? Books that have already been written on that subject. So if it's about that football match I mentioned, my secondary source is existing books that have already covered that match, right? But the thing is, those have all been research pieces done by somebody else. So they've looked at the primary sources and they've reached these conclusions. This is what happened, this is how it happened, this is why it matters. So that's your secondary source. If I am to reach my own conclusion independently, I need to go to the primary sources. Actually look at the hard data of that time and then reach my own conclusion as to what happened. That doesn't mean secondary is bad. Sometimes what happens is, so if I'm writing a book, my first book was on this Travancore personality, right? So my core primary research is about her life, what she did, what she achieved, what were her challenges. That is my core primary resource. But when you write a book, it's not that you jump straight into it, right? You have to set the context for your reader. You have to explain the period for the reader. You have to do a lot of other work in order to make that narrative come alive. There I depend on secondary sources, right? And you use that and make your narrative better using secondary sources. So both matter. It's just that if you're like keen on a certain topic, then your best friend is your primary sources, but also your secondary sources, because you're absorbing different perspectives from it and trying to figure out which is the perspective that fits your, view best, and so on.
Yes. This is the last question. I think we're running out of time right now. Yeah.
So for so many people, what you read in history textbooks, and if you see someone, you aspire to be them. But as the voices of women are limited, how do young women find a voice that resonates with them like in history?
Good point. But actually, it's not as if there aren't enough iconic women in history. There are actually quite a few. It's just that most haven't been given space in history books. And I think that's slowly changing. And therefore, I'm happy about your generation, because now on, you're not only seeing more women's stories being told in history, you're actually seeing more women writing about history. So I'll give you an example. With the Mughals, there was this, there's the whole concept of the harem, right? Where all the begums used to sit behind parda. Now, for the longest time, 100 years ago, historians of that time, when they wrote about the Mughals, they talked about the Mughal emperors, the wars, the politics, all of that. But they never really looked at the harem, thinking that, oh, that's just a domestic space where the begums sat, nothing important there. Somebody like Ira Mukhoti, on the other hand, in her book Daughters of the Sun, actually looks at the harem independently, and she discovers that actually the harem wasn't some place where the begums were sitting in, drenched in perfume, wearing their silks and jewelry and just sort of lounging about all day. No. It was a political institution in its own right. They had their own systems and networks within that. The begums were often diplomats. Sometimes they went out and actually accompanied the sultans and the padshahs to battlefields. The Emperor Humayun lost a 6-year-old daughter who drowned in a river during a battle. What was a 6-year-old child doing there? Which means women were present. When military camps moved, it wasn't just the men and the soldiers going for war. With them, their wives would go, their children would go, there'd be a whole establishment of people following them. Their stories also need to be told. There's another book by a gentleman called David Gilmour, who talks about the British in India. And he's not talking about the British as a colonizing, ruling class. He's talking about ordinary people who came to India during the Raj. And that includes women from Britain. Either they were considered unmarriageable in their home country because they were either too old by then, by the Victorian standards of the time. So they came to India sometimes to find husbands here, because here women were in short supply, so they had a better shot of finding a husband here. Sometimes people came here to escape notorious reputations at home. In London, they would be known as, some kind of like notorious figure. And for a clean slate, they would get on a ship and come to India and sort of reinvent themselves. Indians did that as well. We had a lot of indentured labor that moved to South America and Singapore, all kinds of places during the colonial era. And there's actually people who are called boat Brahmins, because what would happen is they'd get on the boat as members of one caste. By the time they got there, they would start claiming they were highborn Brahmins, because when they got there, nobody knew were in their background, right? In their original life in India. So in those margins, you can still find lots of stories around women and other marginalized aspects of history. But yeah, we just need to slowly like identify those books, and I think you'll find those books as well. There's also somebody called Aparna Jain who's written a book specifically for children, highlighting female figures that they can look up to, as icons and so on. And also, I recommend one more thing if you're into more serious reading. There's a website called 52. And 52 has this profile of a lady called Kamala. I'm forgetting her last name. But you've heard of the Indian Institute of Management? This big MBA thing, one of the top institutes in India. It's been around for decades and so on. And very few people know that IIM Ahmedabad, which is considered the most premier IIM, was actually, in many respects, her brainchild. But because in those days, an institution backed by a woman would not be taken seriously, it was always the men who were the face of things, whereas she was the one who was actually running the show in a very serious way from behind. So there are journalists now pulling out these stories. These icons are emerging from the shadows. It'll happen slowly.
Thank you so much, Manu. And I'm I think everyone is walking away very inspired. And also thank you to the audience, the young people, lovely questions you asked that were really heartfelt.
Yeah,
so
thank you very much and for enduring my very long answers. I can talk a lot.
Brilliant answers.
But thanks for your questions and your patience.
Thank you. Thank you.